HOA instructs mom to remove wheelchair ramp. Meets her gun nut dad. I still remember the day we moved into the house. It was 3 years ago, and everything felt like a fresh start. My parents, Deborah and Patrick, were so excited about this new chapter in their lives. The house wasn't huge or luxurious, but it had a charm that felt just right for us. A 2-story home with a front porch and a small garden that Mom had been eager to fill with flowers. The neighborhood was peaceful too, with friendly neighbors who waved when they passed by but didn't overstep boundaries. It was the kind of place where you felt you could breathe. Life in the new house was good at first. Mom was so full of life back then, always busy with something. She had this habit of humming while she worked, whether it was unpacking boxes, planting roses in the garden, or arranging furniture in her own quirky way. Dad, ever the handyman, spent those first few weeks fixing little things around the house, making it feel more like home. And me? I was just happy to be in a neighborhood where everything seemed calm and uncomplicated. But everything changed about 6 months after we moved in. It was an ordinary day when it happened. Mom had gone out to run some errands. I remember she was in such a good mood that morning, talking about how she wanted to stop by the nursery to pick up more plants for the garden. She kissed me on the forehead, told Dad she'd be back soon, and walked out the door like she always did. None of us could have predicted what was coming. On her way home, as she drove through one of the quieter intersections near our house, a car ran a red light and hit her on the driver's side. The impact was severe. Her car spun out and hit a utility pole. By the time the ambulance arrived, she was conscious but in excruciating pain. I'll never forget the look on Dad's face when he got the call from the hospital. It was like the world had stopped spinning. Mom had multiple fractures in her lower spine and legs. The doctor said she was lucky to be alive, but the damage to her spine was significant. After weeks in the hospital and countless surgeries, it became clear that she wouldn't walk again. They told us that with time, therapy, and the right equipment, she could regain some mobility with a wheelchair, but her days of walking independently were over. When she finally came home, everything felt different. The house that had once been a symbol of fresh beginnings now felt like a constant reminder of what had been lost. Dad immediately stepped into the role of caregiver, as if he'd been preparing for it his whole life. He researched everything, from the best wheelchairs to home modifications that could make her life easier. The decision to install a wheelchair ramp wasn't just a practical one, it was essential. Without it, Mom couldn't even leave the house on her own. I still remember the day the ramp was installed. It was made of sturdy wood, blending in with the house so naturally that it didn't look out of place. Dad made sure it was ADA compliant, with the right slope and rails for safety. He spent hours outside, overseeing the workers and making little adjustments here and there. When Mom first rolled down that ramp in her wheelchair, her face lit up in a way I hadn't seen since the accident. For the first time in months, she felt like she had some control over her life again. She could go outside, feel the sunlight on her face, and just be. The ramp became a lifeline for her, and for us as a family. It wasn't just about mobility, it was about freedom. Before the ramp, Mom had been confined to the house, reliant on us for everything. But now she could move around on her own terms. Sometimes, I'd catch her sitting at the top of the ramp, just staring out at the street, as if she were trying to reconnect with the world outside. About 2 weeks after the ramp was installed, we threw a birthday party for Mom. It wasn't a big event, just a small gathering with some of our neighbors. Mom wanted it to be low-key, but meaningful. She'd always been a private person, but after everything that had happened, she was eager to feel connected to the people around her. Dad grilled burgers out on the porch while Mom greeted the neighbors from her wheelchair. The atmosphere was warm and casual, with kids running around the yard and adults chatting in small groups. Mom's father, a retired police officer, even came by, adding to the family-friendly vibe. He had a way of grounding the room with his quiet presence, always sitting just off to the side, observing. The ramp wasn't a big deal at the party. In fact, most people barely noticed it. It was just there, a part of the house now. A couple of neighbors mentioned it in passing, saying how nice it was that Mom could move around more easily. But that was the extent of it. The focus was on celebrating her, not her disability. For a moment, it felt like things were normal again. Mom was smiling, laughing, and surrounded by people who cared about her. The house felt alive in a way it hadn't since the accident. But then the whispers started. It was about a week after the party when I first heard the rumors. A new HOA president had taken over recently, a woman named Mrs. Montgomery. People were saying she was strict, the kind of person who enforced every rule to the letter. Some neighbors joked about her being a neighborhood dictator, while others shared stories about how she'd forced families to repaint their homes or remove decorations she didn't approve of. At first, I didn't think much of it. We'd been living here for 3 years without any issues. But then, I overheard a conversation that made my stomach drop. Two neighbors were talking about how Mrs. Montgomery had a thing for aesthetic uniformity, and how she didn't like anything that stood out. One of them mentioned the ramp, saying, "I wonder what she'll think about that." When I told Mom what I'd heard, she didn't say much, but I could tell she was worried. The ramp was more than just a modification to her. It was her independence, her freedom. The thought of someone trying to take that away from her was unthinkable. Then one morning a letter arrived. Dad came into the kitchen with a stack of envelopes. Bills, a few flyers, the usual assortment. But one envelope stood out. It had the HOA's official logo on it. At first, he thought it was just another of those newsletters about trimming hedges or keeping the lawn tidy. But as he opened it and read, I saw the color drain from his face. Mom was in the living room, adjusting the cushions on the couch, when he came in holding the letter. "What is it?" she asked, her voice light at first. But when she saw the look on his face, her tone changed. Dad handed her the letter, his face tight with disbelief. She read it, then set it down slowly, her hands shaking. The letter, signed by Mrs. Montgomery, the new HOA president, demanded the removal of the wheelchair ramp. It claimed the ramp violated the neighborhood's aesthetic guidelines, calling it unsightly and an eyesore that disrupted the visual harmony of the community. The letter referred vaguely to the HOA's rules but didn't specify exactly which guidelines the ramp violated. It simply said the ramp must be removed within 30 days or face escalating fines. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The room felt frozen. Mom wheeled herself over to the counter, her expression one of complete disbelief. "This has to be a mistake," she said, her voice cracking. "It can't be right." Dad looked at the letter again, his brow furrowed. "I don't think it's a mistake. They're serious." Mom's voice turned sharp. "But it's necessary. It's the only way I can get around. How can they even call it unsightly? It's a part of our home now." Dad paced back and forth, clearly upset. "It's ridiculous. I'll call them. I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding." When Dad picked up the phone to call the HOA, I could hear the frustration in his voice as he left a message. "Hi, this is Patrick. I'm calling regarding the letter you sent about the wheelchair ramp. We believe this is a misunderstanding, and I'd like to discuss it further." He hung up the phone, muttering under his breath. We waited, hoping for a quick response. Instead, days passed with no word. Finally, Mom received an email from Mrs. Montgomery herself. A cold, impersonal reply that basically confirmed the ramp was still considered a violation. The email didn't provide any specifics, just more vague references to the community's aesthetic guidelines. It was clear they weren't interested in discussing it. Mom tried to remain calm, but I could see the frustration mounting. What's the point of trying to reach out to them? They don't even care about what we're saying, she muttered as she rolled over to the window. She stared out at the neighborhood, the peaceful homes, and the ramp that had made such a difference to her life. Dad sat down next to her, his voice low but determined. "We're not giving up. We'll figure this out." But the tension in the house grew as the days passed. Mom kept hearing more stories from neighbors about Mrs. Montgomery's tough stance on everything. One neighbor, Mr. Harris, who lived across the street, mentioned how he had been fined for not trimming his bushes to the exact height the HOA required. Another neighbor, Mrs. Collins, talked about being forced to repaint her house after the HOA deemed the shade of blue she had chosen too bright. "I can't believe she's going after the bushes," Mom said, shaking her head. "That's just petty." Welcome to Mrs. Montgomery's world. Dad replied with a sigh. She's all about control, and it doesn't matter how small or trivial the issue is. If it doesn't fit her vision of the neighborhood, she'll make you change it. The more Mom thought about it, the more the situation started to feel personal. She began to suspect that Mrs. Montgomery wasn't just being strict about the ramp out of principle. Maybe she was targeting her, using the ramp as a way to make her life harder. The more she thought about it, the more it made sense. A woman with a disability, an easy target for someone with a need to control. I overheard Mom and Dad talking late one night. Mom's voice was tight with frustration as she said, "Do you think she's doing this because of me?" Dad paused for a long moment. "I don't know, but it sure feels like it. I just want to live my life," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't want to be made to feel like a problem." "We won't let her do that," Dad replied firmly. "We're not backing down. We'll fight this." So that's what they decided to do. They reached out to a lawyer who specialized in disability rights. The lawyer, a woman named Maria Roberts, was kind but direct. She listened to Mom's story and then explained, calmly and professionally, that under the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, Mom had the right to modify her home to accommodate her mobility issues. The ramp, she explained, was a necessary modification, and the HOA couldn't legally force them to remove it simply because they didn't like the way it looked. "You're within your rights to keep the ramp," Maria said. "The HOA can't take that away from you." Hearing this was a huge relief to Mom and Dad. For the first time in days, they felt a flicker of hope. A few days later, another letter arrived. This time, it was a formal notice from the HOA board, summoning Mom to a hearing to discuss the future of the ramp. The letter was official and intimidating, and it made the situation feel all the more real. Dad and Mom sat down to go over their plan. "We need to make sure we're fully prepared," Dad said. "We'll bring all the documentation, all the proof that the ramp is necessary, and we'll make our case." Mom nodded, though her hands shook slightly as she prepared the medical documentation. The pressure was starting to mount. The hearing would be in just a few days, and though she was determined, I could see how much it was weighing on her. The day of the hearing arrived with a mixture of determination and anxiety. It felt like the weight of everything that had happened so far was building up to this one moment. Mom had been preparing for weeks, gathering medical documents, speaking with our lawyer, and doing everything she could to make sure she was ready for whatever the HOA threw at her. She wasn't about to let them take away something so vital to her life. When the time came, Dad and Mom entered the HOA meeting room, me trailing behind them. We had practiced what to say, how to present ourselves. But as we stepped through the door, I could feel the tension in the air. The room was cold and sterile, nothing like the warmth of our living room or the comfort of home. It felt more like a courtroom than a place for community discussion. The board members sat around the long table, barely glancing up as we made our way in. They looked so indifferent, their faces unreadable, but I could tell they weren't interested in hearing what we had to say. At the head of the table sat Mrs. Montgomery, the new HOA president. Her presence dominated the room. She sat with her arms crossed, a stern expression on her face. Her eyes never softened, even as she greeted us. If there was any warmth to her, it was buried beneath her rigid authority. She wasted no time, launching straight into the meeting by asserting that the wheelchair ramp must be removed. "The ramp is unsightly," she declared in a tone that suggested she'd already made up her mind. "It disrupts the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. It doesn't fit in with the community's image, and it must be removed." Her words were sharp, each one hitting like a hammer, but they were also vague. She didn't cite any specific guidelines that the ramp violated, just a general condemnation of its appearance. It was as if she expected us to accept her words without question. I could see the frustration building in Mom's eyes, but she stayed calm. With Dad by her side, Mom took a deep breath, preparing herself to respond. "This ramp is necessary for my daily life," she said, her voice steady but firm. "I use it to get around. Without it, I wouldn't be able to leave the house. This isn't about aesthetics. It's about my health and my well-being. I have the right to make modifications to my home under the ADA, and the ramp is part of that." She held up the legal documentation, showing them her right to have the ramp installed. The board members looked down at it, but Mrs. Montgomery barely spared it a glance. Instead, she interrupted, her voice growing colder. "It doesn't matter," she said, cutting Mom off. "The ramp is still in violation. It must be removed." It was like hitting a wall. Her dismissiveness was so complete, so final, that it felt like she wasn't even listening. There was no consideration of Mom's situation, no empathy. Just the cold, calculated insistence that the ramp had to go. I could see Mom's hands tremble as she clutched the sides of her wheelchair. She wasn't going to back down, but the weight of the situation was starting to sink in. This wasn't just a simple conversation anymore. It wasn't about finding a compromise. It was about power. And Mrs. Montgomery was using the authority of the HOA to force her will, with no room for discussion or compromise. The tension in the room grew thick. I watched Mom's face, her resolve hardening, but I could tell it wasn't easy for her. She sat up straighter in her chair, her voice more forceful. "This ramp is not just an aesthetic choice," she said, her words cutting through the air like a blade. "It's a lifeline for me. I won't remove it. It's the only way I can live my life and take care of my own needs. I refuse to let anyone take that away from me." There was silence around the table. No one spoke, but I could feel the cold weight of their gaze. Mrs. Montgomery's face remained impassive, but there was no doubt in my mind that she was holding onto her stance like a bulldog with a bone. The board members didn't speak up to support us. They just sat there, like passive observers to a conversation they had no intention of influencing. The president, however, was not so passive. She reiterated her demand, almost robotically. "The ramp must be removed. The HOA's authority stands. We will not allow such violations to continue." And that was it. The meeting ended with no resolution. Mrs. Montgomery handed us a final notice, which laid out her stance in more detail. We had 30 days to remove the ramp or face escalating fines, and worse, legal action. She threatened to place a lien on our property if we refused to comply. As we left the meeting, I couldn't help but feel the weight of what had just happened. I could tell Mom and Dad were trying to keep their heads up, trying to act like they hadn't just been told that their home wasn't truly theirs. But I could see the frustration in their eyes. They knew what was coming next. They knew that the HOA wasn't going to back down, and neither were they. At home, things felt heavier than ever. The house that had once been a place of comfort and warmth now felt like a battleground. We sat around the kitchen table going over our options. "I'm not backing down," Mom said, her voice firm despite the exhaustion in it. "This ramp stays. We'll figure out what to do next." Dad nodded in agreement. "We can't let them win. We have to stand up for ourselves." They started talking about the next steps, preparing for a legal battle, getting our lawyer involved more directly. But despite their resolve, the stress of it all was weighing on Mom. A few days later, Mom's father, my grandpa, came to visit. He was a retired police officer, a man who had always been there for Mom when she needed him. He had a no-nonsense attitude that I knew would help. When he heard about the HOA's treatment of Mom, he didn't hesitate. He stayed with us for a while, just in case things escalated. Grandpa reassured Mom that he would do whatever it took to protect her home and her rights. He knew how to deal with people who tried to bully others into submission. Mom, though reluctant to get him involved, found comfort in knowing he had her back. "Don't worry, kiddo," Grandpa said, his voice gruff but full of warmth. "We'll take care of this. They won't know what hit them." With his support, Mom felt a little stronger. One afternoon, while Grandpa was staying with us, the HOA president arrived at our house with a team of workers. Their intent was clear. They had come to remove the ramp. Grandpa, who had been sitting out front in the rocking chair, noticed them first. He rose from his seat, walking slowly but steadily toward them, his eyes narrowing as he approached the workers. His weathered face, usually calm, now held a hint of steely resolve. "What are you doing here?" Grandpa asked, his voice firm and commanding. The workers stopped in their tracks, momentarily caught off guard. One of them, looking uncomfortable, muttered something about orders from the HOA. Grandpa, however, wasn't buying it. "You have no right to be here," he continued, his stance unwavering. This ramp stays. The workers exchanged glances, clearly unsure of how to proceed. They hesitated for a moment, but then one of them began to lift a tool, as if to start the dismantling. That's when Grandpa's hand went to his side. In an instant, he pulled out his legal firearm, holding it steady at his side as he gave the workers a stern look. "Leave now. I'm not going to warn you again." The workers froze, panic flashing across their faces. One of them, perhaps out of fear or confusion, turned to run but tripped over his own feet, stumbling and falling to the ground with a loud thud. The scene quickly became chaotic as the workers scrambled to retreat, some of them nearly bumping into each other in their haste. Within seconds, they were gone, scurrying back to their truck and leaving our property untouched. Grandpa stood there for a moment longer, watching them drive off, then holstered the gun and returned to his seat. His calm demeanor didn't falter, but there was a quiet satisfaction in his eyes. He had protected us, just like he promised. When Mom and Dad returned home, they were shocked to hear about what had happened. Grandpa sat in his favorite chair in the living room, looking remarkably calm considering the chaos he had just caused. He recounted the entire incident in detail, with the same steady demeanor he always had. "I saw the workers," Grandpa began. "They were trying to take down the ramp, so I stepped outside and told them to leave. Told them they didn't have permission to be here. They didn't listen, so I made sure they understood the situation." He paused, a small grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. Dad and Mom exchanged glances, their faces filled with a mixture of disbelief and admiration. "We got security footage of the whole thing," Dad said, showing the clip of the workers fleeing in panic. Mom's quiet laugh was a sound of relief, and I couldn't help but smile too. It was almost hard to believe how it had unfolded. Word spread quickly throughout the neighborhood. People who had been keeping their heads down now began talking openly. Some were still wary of the HOA's power, but many of them had begun to see Mom and Dad's stand as something worth supporting. They had resisted an overbearing authority and, in a way, had taken a stand for the rest of the neighborhood too. The HOA, having been publicly humiliated and seeing the growing unrest in the neighborhood, quickly decided to back down. They removed the lien from our property and, after a brief meeting, agreed that the ramp would remain in place. Mom and Dad spent the evening quietly reflecting on everything that had happened. The neighborhood, although shaken by the events, began to change in small ways. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak up began discussing how they could stand up for themselves in the future, and many of them started to speak out about Mrs. Montgomery's overreach. In the end, while the HOA president had lost this battle, the neighborhood had gained something far more valuable: a sense of unity and the courage to resist unjust control.